2 words. That is all, the telegram said. It crossed the Atlantic in December of 1873 and landed in the hands of a Chicago lawyer who had spent days not knowing whether his family was alive or dead. 2 words. Saved alone. His wife had survived. His 4 daughters were gone. And what that man did next on a ship in the middle of the ocean, passing over the very stretch of water where his children drowned, became one of the most sung songs in the history of the Christian faith. But the story you have heard about that song is smaller than the real one. Because It Is Well With My Soul was not written by a man who felt well. It was written by a man standing at the bottom of his life with 3 miles of water between him and everything he loved. And once you see how those words were actually born, you will never sing them the same way again. To understand what those 2 words cost, you have to meet the man before the ocean took everything. Horatio Spafford was not a broken soul looking for a song. He was a senior partner in a thriving Chicago law firm. A devout Presbyterian elder, his cottage on the north side of the city was a meeting place for the reformers and revivalists of his generation. Men like Dwight Moody sat at his table. He had a wife he adored, Anna, a Norwegian immigrant, who had first walked into his Sunday school class as a teenager, and 4 daughters, Annie, Maggie, Bessie, and little Tanetta. Success, faith, family, standing. And in the spring of 1871, he did what successful men do. He invested, real estate, along the north edge of a booming Chicago. Then, in October of that same year, the sky over the city turned orange. The Great Fire of Chicago burned the city to ashes, and Spafford's fortune went into the smoke with it. But here is the detail most retellings rush past. The fire was not the tragedy. The fire was the opening move. Because for the next 2 years, the Spaffords poured themselves into a wounded city, and the strain wore Anna's health down to the wire. So Horatio planned a rest. An extended stay in Europe for his wife and his girls. Friends were going. Moody was preaching in Britain. It made perfect sense. And at the last moment, business held him in Chicago. He kissed his family goodbye, promised to follow in a few days, and put his wife and 4 daughters on a French steamer bound for Europe. The ship was called the Ville du Havre. He never saw his daughters again. November 1873, the middle of the Atlantic. The Ville du Havre was one of the most luxurious ocean liners afloat, the kind of ship that made passengers forget they were floating over an abyss. And in the dark of early morning, an iron sailing ship called the Lochiern came out of the night and rammed her amidships. Now hold the next number gently, because it is not a statistic. It is a window of time, 12 minutes. That is how long it took for the entire ship to go under. 12 minutes is not long enough to organize lifeboats. It is barely long enough to wake up, to understand, to find the stairs. It is nowhere near long enough for a mother to gather 4 children in the tilting corridors of a dying ship. Anna reached the deck with her girls. Survivors later described the water going quiet in a way no one who heard it ever forgot. When it was over, Anna was found floating unconscious on a piece of wreckage, and sailors pulled her from the sea. The ship that struck them was itself crippled and close to sinking. A passing cargo vessel, the Tri-Mountain, arrived in time to take the survivors off the water. Anna woke to a rescue she had not asked for. Her arms were empty. Annie, Maggie, Bessie, Tanetta, all 4 gone in the time it takes to make a cup of coffee and drink it. And here is the part that turns the stomach. The sea did not even leave her the mercy of not knowing. She had held them. She had lost them. And now she was alive, drifting on the Atlantic, with nothing left to do but survive her own rescue. For days, Horatio Spafford lived in the silence every parent fears most. A newspaper report that the ship was lost, and no word of who lived. The survivors were carried the rest of the way across the ocean 9 more days at sea, to Cardiff, in Wales. 9 days in which Anna knew what her husband did not. And on the 1st of December 1873, she stood in a telegraph office, with a form in front of her, forced to compress the destruction of her family into a cable charged by the word. What she wrote is preserved to this day in the Library of Congress. Saved alone, what shall I do? Read that second line again. It is not a report. It is a question no husband can answer. A fellow survivor of the wreck, a pastor named Weiss, remembered what Anna said in those first days, and his memory of it has carried down to us. God gave me 4 daughters. Now they have been taken from me. Someday I will understand why. Notice what that sentence is not. It is not peace. It is not a hymn. It is a mother holding 2 things that should never have to fit. In the same hand, the loss and the refusal to let go of God. Someday I will understand why. That is not the sound of a woman who feels well. That is the sound of a woman who has decided to trust before the understanding arrives. Hold on to that sentence, because her husband is about to do the same thing with a pen. Horatio left Chicago on the next available ship, and somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic, the captain called him to his cabin. He had something to tell him that no captain wants to say, and no father wants to hear. They were passing over the place. The spot of ocean where the Ville du Havre had gone down, where his daughters were. Think about what that moment asks of a man. He cannot stop the ship. He cannot go down to them. He can only stand at the rail while the water slides past, indistinguishable from every other mile of gray Atlantic, except that this mile holds everything. We do not have to guess what happened inside him, because he wrote it down. Days later, in a letter to Rachel, his wife's half-sister, Horatio described that night. On Thursday last, we passed over the spot where she went down in mid-ocean, the waters 3 miles deep. But I do not think of our dear ones there. They are safe, folded, the dear lambs, 3 miles deep. He had asked. He wanted to know the exact depth of his loss. And then he looked straight down through all 3 miles of it and said, they are not there. Safe, folded. That is a shepherd's word, what you do with lambs at nightfall. And it was on that crossing, over that water, that Horatio Spafford began to write. When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll. Sea billows. He was not reaching for a metaphor. He was looking at the thing itself. Whatever my lot thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul. Slow down and look at what those words actually claim, because it is not what most people think. Taught me to say, not taught me to feel. The hymn never announces that the pain is gone. It never pretends the girls are not gone. It declares something narrower and far stronger, that beneath the wreckage, at the level of the soul, an anchor still holds. This is the peace Paul describes in Philippians 4-7. A peace that passes understanding, which is another way of saying a peace that arrives before the explanation does. Anna's sentence and Horatio's verse are the same faith at 2 temperatures. Someday I will understand why. It is well with my soul. Neither one is a feeling, both are decisions, and the hymn keeps climbing. By the 3rd verse, Spafford is barely talking about the ocean at all. My sin, not in part but the whole, is nailed to the cross, and I bear it no more. A man who has just lost everything, and the wound he reaches for is sin. Forgiven the debt, Colossians says, was nailed to the cross and canceled. And the final verse does something no grief counselor would dare suggest. It looks forward. And Lord, haste the day when the faith shall be sight, the clouds be rolled back as a scroll. That is Isaiah's image, the heavens rolled up like a scroll, joined to Paul's trumpet from 1 Corinthians 15, the dead raised, death itself undone. Read it slowly and you realize what this man is actually doing. A father who has just sailed over his daughter's grave ends his song by asking God to hurry. Haste the day, hurry the morning the sea gives them back. He is not writing a eulogy for 4 girls. He is writing a countdown to a reunion. Now, here is where honesty matters more than a tidy story. The scene at the captain's cabin, the summons, the exact spot, the pen moving that same night reaches us through the family itself, told by a daughter born after the tragedy, in a memoir written decades later. No ship's log confirms the moment the ink touched paper, and memory, especially grieving memory, smooths its edges. So could the famous scene be more polished than the night it describes? It could, but notice what does not depend on anyone's memory: the letter. Written within days, preserved in an archive, in his own hand, the waters 3 miles deep, they are safe, folded. Whether the hymn was finished at that rail or refined, in the months after, the letter proves the heart it came from. The legend may have soft edges. The faith underneath it is documented. The words alone were not yet a song. A friend of Spafford's, Philip Bliss, one of the great gospel songwriters of that generation, set the text to music. And when the time came to name the tune, Bliss did something quietly devastating. Hymn tunes carry names. He could have called it Peace, or Assurance, or anything soft. He named it Ville du Havre, the ship. To this day, in hymnal after hymnal, the melody that carries it is "Well with my soul" bears the name of the vessel that took the 4 girls down. The grief is written into the music's own name, not erased, enshrined. Moody himself, when the news reached him, went to the Spaffords in England to sit with them in it. And if this were a film, it would end there. The hymn written, the faith proven, the credits rolling. It did not end there. 3 years after the sinking, Anna gave birth to a son. They named him Horatio, after his father. And in 1880, at 4 years old, the boy died too. Let that land. The man who wrote Whatever My Lot Was handed another lot. The parents who had already buried 4 children in the ocean now buried a son in the ground. Their church, steeped in the cold arithmetic that equated suffering with punishment, treated their calamity as something close to judgment, and the Spaffords walked away from that congregation, but not from God. They left America altogether. They moved to Jerusalem, and they spent the rest of their lives there, running a community that became known as the American colony, feeding the hungry and serving the city's poor, regardless of who they were. The man who wrote it did not retreat from a world that had taken 6 of his children. He went out and fed it. So what do you actually do with a story like this? Because you were not on that ship. But you have your own stretch of ocean, the diagnosis, the empty chair. The telegram-shaped moment when life compressed into a few unthinkable words. And the temptation in that moment is to believe you must feel peace before you can claim it. Horatio Spafford's life says otherwise. 2 words took his family. 12 minutes took his daughters. 3 miles of water stood between him and his girls. And he stood at the rail above all of it and said, "It is well," not because it felt well, but because he knew where his children were, and he knew where his anchor was. "It is well" is not a mood. It is a verdict spoken in advance, from above the storm, by a soul that knows the storm does not get the final word. That is why this song has followed coffins and hospital beds and flooded towns for 150 years. Not because it denies the sea billows, because it was written on top of them. Whatever your lot, whatever rolls over you, whatever goes down into, water too deep to follow the anchor Spafford found is still there. And the hymn does not ask you to feel it. It teaches you to say it. It is well. It is well with my soul. If this story steadied something in you, share it with someone who is standing at their own rail tonight. And if you want more true stories of where the great hymns were actually born, the history behind the faith, stay close.